example of how the genre is able to explore new settings, examine the limits of more traditional examples of the genre, and contemplate the meaning of justice. For example, just as some African American writers consider the context of slavery in their mystery and suspense narratives, so some Native American writers contemplate the meaning of crime and justice when considered against the background of Native American genocide. In addition, many Native American mysteries complicate the spatial and thematic limits of traditional mystery and suspense fiction by using settings that span several states, as well as incorporating mythical and cultural elements that aren't found in many other examples of the genre. In these ways, Native American mystery and suspense fiction writers take some traditional elements of the genre and adapt them for their own purposes, demonstrating both the limits and the flexibility of the genre. One figure currently towers above every other writer in the field of Native American mystery and suspense fiction. And he's not Native American, but white. I'm referring to Tony Hillerman, who was born in Sacred Heart, Oklahoma in 1925. Hillerman and his siblings were among a very small number of white children who attended a school in Sacred Heart called St. Mary's Academy, which was actually a boarding school for Native American girls. Growing up, most of Hillerman's playmates were children from the Potawatomi and Seminole tribes, and this experience gave him an early familiarity with Native American cultures. Hillerman served as a mortar gunner in World War II, where he was injured and received the Purple Heart. After being hospitalized for several months in France, he then returned to the US and began working for a company that transported oil field equipment. During this period, Hillerman visited a Navajo reservation where he witnessed the Enemy Way ceremony. This ceremony was designed for members of the Navajo tribe who had served in the war, and its purpose was to cleanse them of any negative influences they had encountered during their wartime experiences. Hillerman later said that witnessing this ceremony made him want to learn more about Navajo culture, which would later turn out to be a major part of his mystery fiction. Hillerman had always wanted to write fiction. For many years he worked as a journalist, but it wasn't until the late 1960s, when he was in his mid-40s, that he began to write his first novel. Although Hillerman later said he'd always wanted to write a mainstream novel, he decided to write a mystery novel because he thought it would be an easier sell for a first-time author. The result of Hillerman's labors was The Blessing Way, which was published in 1970. The novel is significant for several reasons, some of which have to do with Hillerman's subsequent career, and some of which are concerned with Hillerman's later influence on Native American mystery and suspense fiction as a whole. First of all, let's consider the setting. Like many of Hillerman's later novels, The Blessing Way is set on the Navajo Reservation, an area covering some 16 million acres in what is known as the Four Corners area, where the states of New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Colorado meet. This setting is significant for a couple of reasons. Many of Hillerman's novels would later be praised for their exploration of the Native American cultures of the southwestern region of the United States, and for their detailed and evocative descriptions of landscape. This means that Hillerman's work is distinctive compared to most other examples of the genre because it uses neither city nor rural settings. Instead, a typical Hillerman novel ranges over a much larger and more various landscape, which is one of the reasons his work is so appealing and popular with so many readers. Moreover, given that Hillerman's mystery novels are police procedurals, which I'll say more about in a moment, the size and variety of the setting is also significant for more pragmatic reasons having to do with police jurisdiction. In The Blessing Way, Hillerman introduces Joe Leaphorn, who would go on to become one of his 2 main series characters. Leaphorn is a detective in the Navajo Tribal Police, which at first glance might seem like an odd choice for a Native American mystery novel. Why? For the same reason that it's odd that African-American writer Chester Himes would have chosen to write a series of police procedural novels featuring black detectives. Inasmuch as police officers would be regarded by many as default representatives of the dominant, i.e. white power structure, why would Himes and Hillerman want to make their protagonists cops? In Himes's case, the reason has to do with his desire to explore the tensions inherent in black men working for a system that is inherently racist. And I believe there's some of the same impulse present in Hillerman's decision. More significant, however, is the fact that Leaphorn and his colleagues in the Navajo Tribal Police often find themselves in conflict with, rather than working hand in hand with, other law enforcement organizations. This is where we come back to the issue of jurisdiction. Because Hillerman uses the Four Corners setting, many of the cases that Leaphorn investigates necessarily cross state lines. This means that regular police departments can't investigate them due to jurisdictional limitations. The Navajo Tribal Police can, though, a fact that often leads to conflict. Leaphorn and his colleagues often also find themselves at odds with the FBI, who are not bound by jurisdictional limitations either, but who, from Leaphorn's point of view, often try to take over his investigations, ignoring the fact that the Navajo reservation is sovereign territory. We can see from the preceding discussion how creatively Hillerman is able to use some of the defining features of the police procedural genre to address larger questions involving conflict between white American and Native American cultures. And this brings us to another reason that The Blessing Way is significant. As in many of his later works, Hillerman's debut novel features a Navajo character who is caught between 2 cultures and who belongs to neither of them completely. The character is named Luis Horseman, and at one point, Leaphorn thinks to himself about Horseman, just another poor soul who didn't quite know how to be a Navajo and couldn't learn to act like a white. This remark is typical of the way in which much of Hillerman's work focuses on questions of identity and belonging. Leaphorn distinguishes himself throughout the series not only by his abilities as a detective, but also by his ability to move adroitly between the white and Native American cultures. He's able to occupy the liminal space between them, and he frequently uses that ability to his advantage. In this respect, it's interesting to compare Leaphorn to Hillerman's other main series character, Jim Chee, another Navajo tribal policeman who is first introduced to readers in Hillerman's 1980 novel, People of Darkness. Not only is he some 20 years younger than Leaphorn, but he's also, in Hillerman's words, less culturally assimilated than his colleague, in the sense that his indigenous religious beliefs are much more traditional. Beginning with his 1986 novel Skinwalkers, which marks the first time the 2 series protagonists appear in the same book, Hillerman uses the differences between them to develop both characters in more detail. He also inaugurates what would become an ongoing emphasis on generational differences between the 2 men, which in turn Hillerman uses to reflect on the complexities and changes in Navajo identity that take place over the course of the novels. Before moving on to look at other Native American mystery and suspense narratives, we need to consider one final aspect of Hillerman's work that makes it extremely influential on other writers. Despite the significance of The Blessing Way, Hillerman once said that he found it quite an embarrassing book to look back on because it's filled with inaccuracies about Navajo culture. As a result of diligent and exhaustive research on his part, Hillerman largely avoided this problem in his other books. Consequently, many of the novels featuring Leaphorn and Chi also possess a valuable pedagogic dimension for non-Native American readers, who can learn a great deal about Native American cultures and about issues impacting Native Americans from reading them. For example, in Skinwalkers, Chi, who, as usual, is concerned about conflicts between his Navajo identity and white culture, completes his training and becomes a Yatali, a singer qualified to conduct Navajo religious rites such as the Blessing Way and the Enemy Way. In the process, the reader learns a lot about these ceremonies. And in such novels as A Thief of Time, which was published in 1988 and was Hillerman's own favorite among his many books, and Talking God, which came out in 1989, Hillerman explores a wide range of issues of concern to contemporary Native Americans, including the theft of Native American artifacts and the refusal of some museums to return Native American skeletons in their collections to tribal members. Over the course of a long, prolific, and successful career then, Tony Hillerman set the bar very high for other authors of Native American mystery and suspense fiction. How did they respond? The short answer to the question is, given the diversity of Native American cultures, in a variety of ways. Unlike Tony Hillerman, the vast majority of whose work consists of mysteries, other writers have only turned to mystery and suspense fiction occasionally to address the concerns that animate their other work. Linda Hogan, for example, who was born in 1947 and is a member of the Chickasaw Nation, is known primarily as a poet, although she has also written novels, short stories, plays, and essays. Despite writing in a variety of genres, Hogan addresses the same group of concerns in much of her work: environmentalism, social justice, what nature can teach human beings, and the regenerative power of women. Hogan combines many of these concerns in her single mystery novel, Mean Spirit, which was published in 1990 and nominated for the Pulitzer Prize in Fiction the following year. Hogan sets Mean Spirit in northeastern Oklahoma in the 1920s, during a period known as the Osage Oil Boom, but which the Osage themselves call the Reign of Terror or the Great Frenzy. The boom was triggered by the discovery of huge amounts of oil underneath land that was owned by Native Americans. Since the income from the oil was divided equally among all Osage tribe members, this meant that during this period a white man could become very rich from marrying an Osage woman. In fact, in Mean Spirit, Hogan quotes directly from an actual letter written by a white man in Missouri to an Indian agent in Oklahoma, asking the agent to help him find an Osage wife. Part of the letter reads as follows: "Not a full-blood, but one as near white as possible. In exchange for helping him find a woman, the man offers to pay a fee. For every $5,000 she is worth, I will give you $25. Against this historical background of white greed and exploitation of Native Americans in general, and Native American women in particular, in Mean Spirit, Hogan tells the story of two families, the Blankets and the Gray Clouds. Thanks to the oil boom, Grace Blanket has become the richest woman in town, but this leads to her murder by a group of white men who want her wealth. Because Grace's daughter, Nola, witnessed the murder, she is now in danger and is sent to live with the Gray Cloud family to protect her. When members of that family start dying off in mysterious circumstances, the desperate family writes to the federal government in Washington, D.C., begging for help. Help comes in the somewhat unlikely form of Stace Redhawk, a Lakota Sioux who works for the U.S. Bureau of Investigation. Why do I say unlikely? Well, Tony Hillerman's Jim Chi rejects the possibility of becoming an FBI agent, even though he's been accepted into the FBI Academy because he doubts that he can be both Navajo and a representative of the federal government. So, when Red Hawk first enters the narrative, we have good cause to wonder where exactly his loyalties lie. And indeed, it turns out that Red Hawk does feel some conflict between his two identities. Ultimately, the situation in Osage territory will force Red Hawk to choose sides. As his investigation gradually uncovers an elaborate scheme involving intimidation, fraud, and murder, Red Hawk not only solves the mystery, but also comes to feel an increasing degree of closeness to both the other Native American characters and to the land. I'm aware that if you haven't read Mean Spirit, then this narrative resolution might sound a little too pat and hokey, but it works. And the reason it works is because Hogan is accomplished at describing Native American beliefs and values in such a way that they constitute a persuasive and much healthier alternative to the violence, materialism, and greed that define the dominant culture. By using the form of the historical mystery in Mean Spirit, Hogan is able to go back in time and explore an episode that still resonates for Native Americans and whites today. In fact, if anything, the deeply moral choice between exploiting the resources of the land and the people who live on that land on the one hand, and finding a way to live in harmony with nature on the other, is even more relevant in the 21st century than it was in the 1920s. In this way, Hogan reminds us of how effective mystery and suspense fiction can be in dramatizing issues of justice, not just in the narrow legal sense, but also in a much broader and more ethical sense. Sherman Alexie is another good example of a Native American author who writes in a number of different genres and who has written a single mystery narrative to explore questions of identity and social justice. But, as we'll see, Alexie's mystery novel isn't just very different from Hogan's Mean Spirit, it's also quite different from the rest of Alexie's work. Sherman Alexie was born in 1966 in Spokane, Washington, and grew up on the Spokane Reservation. Alexie is of mixed ancestry. His father was a member of the Coeur d'Alene tribe, while his mother was of Colville, Choctaw, Spokane, and European-American ancestry. Due to major surgery he had to have as a small child and the resulting side effects, Alexie was unable to participate in many of the rituals that mark the maturation of a young Native American man. And so he grew up a somewhat solitary child with a reputation for devouring any book he could get his hands on. Alexie's writing career began with the publication in 1992 of his first collection of poems entitled The Business of Fancy Dancing. Since then, he's published many other collections of poems, but is also well known for his short stories. His first collection of stories, The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fistfight in Heaven, was published in 1993. Alexie would revisit some of the characters in this collection in his first novel, Reservation Blues, which came out in 1995. As this brief summary indicates, Alexie is a prolific author who writes in a variety of genres. But according to critic Sarah Quirk, Alexie asks the same series of questions in all of his work. What does it mean to live as an Indian in this time? What does it mean to be an Indian man? Finally, what does it mean to live on an Indian reservation? Alexie's answers to these questions are both honest and painful, but rarely optimistic. Throughout his work, his characters struggle with feelings of powerlessness and exclusion in relation to white society, a struggle that often results in various forms of self-destructive behavior, especially alcoholism. And yet, if these words suggest that Alexie's work is characterized by sadness, in fact, a wonderful sense of humor pervades much of his work. Some of this humor comes from his frequent use of pop culture references, especially pop cultural appropriations of Native Americans. But it also comes from an appreciation of both the absurdity of life and the importance of humor as a survival mechanism for Native Americans. As Quirk explains, for Alexie, humor is a means of cultural survival for American Indians. Survival in the face of the larger American culture's stereotypes of American Indians and their concomitant distillation of individual tribal characteristics into one pan-Indian consciousness. I've done my best to reconstruct the outline and tenor of Alexie's work, not only as a way of encouraging you to explore that work, but also to emphasize how different his only mystery novel, Indian Killer, is from the rest of his oeuvre. Rejecting the humor that characterizes so much of the rest of his work, in this novel, Alexie is at his angriest. Published in 1996, Indian Killer tells the story of a young Native American man ironically named John Smith. How is this ironic? Because Alexie's character shares a name with the English soldier and explorer who is famous for helping found Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in North America. Alexie's John Smith got his name because he was adopted by a white American couple, a fact that accentuates how cut off Smith is from his own native culture. This is accentuated even more when we learn that Smith has no idea who his birth parents are, and consequently has no idea what tribe he belongs to. Filled with anger by both his own treatment and the treatment of other Native Americans at the hands of whites, Smith becomes convinced that at the end of the 20th century, Native Americans have become too docile, and as a result, whites are no longer afraid of them. In Alexie's chilling words, John wanted to change that. He wanted to see fear in every pair of blue eyes. Consequently, Smith embarks on a murder spree in which he kills white men at random and also scalps them. Alexie reverses the assumed meaning of the book's title, Indian Killer, which most readers, at least before reading the book, would assume refers to someone who kills Indians. Instead, we realize that Alexie is using the term to mean an Indian who kills. And yet, here's the twist. We never actually see John Smith commit any murders. Although he talks and thinks obsessively about wanting to do so, we never see him come into contact with the victims. And the investigative part of the narrative is told from a third-person point of view that gives nothing away about who the actual perpetrator might be. At the end of the novel, Smith kills himself by jumping off a skyscraper, so we never get a chance to find out the truth from him. Moreover, Alexie never confirms whether or not Smith is the killer, and so the identity of the killer remains a mystery when we finish the book. Why does Alexie do this? The best way of answering this question is to contemplate how we'd feel if Alexie had confirmed that Smith was the killer. Without the ambiguity concerning whether or not Smith was the murderer, Indian Killer becomes a less complex and less interesting book. We may or may not feel sympathy for Smith's anger and frustration at the situation of Native Americans, but very few of us would endorse Smith's actions, no matter how sympathetic we feel. But because we don't know one way or another, we're left to ponder another question. Why did we assume that Smith was indeed the killer? Partly because Alexie did everything in his power to make us think that, but perhaps also because, we might think to ourselves, something about the idea of a bloodthirsty Indian killing white men at random just makes sense to us. At this point, we begin to appreciate just how subversive Alexie's use of the mystery novel is, upending our typical assumptions about guilt, innocence, and justice. The inconclusiveness of Indian Killer's conclusion encourages us to look in the mirror and examine ourselves rather than making John Smith the scapegoat, no matter how superficially satisfying that ending might appear to be. Alexie sets Indian Killer in the present and in the urban setting of Seattle as a way of emphasizing the fact that Native American issues are still very much relevant and pressing today and not something that can be safely confined to the past. The last author I want to discuss in this lecture, Marty, Oakley, Medawar, takes a very different approach to these issues, but is still able to make a valuable and entertaining contribution to Native American mystery and suspense fiction. Medawar is of Cherokee descent and was born in Louisiana. She's published one mystery novel with a contemporary setting, Murder on the Red Cliff Res, which was published in 2002 and is set on the Red Cliff Reservation in Wisconsin, where Medawar now lives. The majority of her mystery novels, however, are set in the 19th century and deal mostly with the Kiowa and Crow tribes. Medawar's historical mysteries are known collectively as the Tay Bodal series and are named after the series' protagonist. Beginning with the publication of Death at Rainy Mountain in 1996, the series also consists of Witch of the Palo Duro, Murder at Medicine Lodge, and concludes with the Fort Larned incident, which was published in 2000. Although the series takes place during the period of Indian removal and the realization of the ideology of manifest destiny, the series is suffused with both humor and an optimism about the ability of Native American ways to survive. Much of this humor and optimism is generated by Tay Bodal, who, while unmistakably Native American, also possesses elements of the classical detectives of old. For example, like Auguste Dupin and Sherlock Holmes, Tay Bodal is something of an outsider in relation to the Kiowa tribe he's a member of. More interested in healing, herbs, medicine, and the mysteries of the human body than in tribal councils and war parties, Tay Bodal is regarded as being very eccentric by his fellow tribe members. And yet, throughout the mysteries he appears in, Tay Bodal proves his worth, whether it's by solving the murder of a candidate for the position of tribal chief, or by clearing the name of Kiowa chief White Bear after a U.S. soldier is murdered during treaty talks. Through the character of Tay Bodal, Medawar is able to combine commentary about key events in the history of the American West with information about Native American cultures. This combination has, in one way or another, characterized the work of every writer we've looked at in this lecture. The variety of their work reminds us that there is no one infallible or correct way to manage the interaction between Native American history and culture on the one hand, and mystery and suspense fiction on the other. Like both African American and Latino varieties of the genre, examples of Native American mystery and suspense fiction are extremely adept at exploring issues of cultural identity and interaction. In doing so, they add a thought-provoking and valuable dimension to the genre as a whole.